I'm Vice Signal, and this is Cancel Lincoln.
By the early 1800s, most of the Northern U.S. states either abolished slavery by statute or enacted laws to gradually end it, but mostly not out of concern for the well-being of blacks or a belief in racial equality. New Englanders widely believed that blacks were inferior beings, not worthy of sharing a society with, even as slaves, and that any intermingling with them would lead to contamination of their ideal white Christian society. Abraham Lincoln also believed this. He acted on it by deporting blacks to Liberia and the Caribbean en masse via his leadership role in the American Colonization Society, which was founded for this purpose. Famed New England writer Ralph Waldo Emerson predicted that because they were inadequate beings, blacks would, quote, follow the dodo into extinction, close quote. This ardently racist attitude was perfectly consistent with the cultural genealogy of New England. They were, after all, the descendants of Puritans, a religious sect of people so fanatical in their dogma that they executed their compatriots at just the suspicion of witch-like behavior. Therefore, it is no coincidence that it was Boston's Harvard University that developed and promulgated the pseudo-discipline of race science, which alleged to scientifically prove the genetic inferiority of blacks. Given this, as the black population grew, the North worked to wean themselves off of their dependence on slave labor and systematically cleanse their society of blacks at the first available opportunity, which is what came with the arrival of masses of white European immigrants, who they scooped up to replace black laborers. But another reason for the replacement of black laborers was the evolution of the Northern economy, which shifted from mostly agricultural to industrial manufacturing based over the course of the 19th century. The jobs necessitated by this transition required workers to possess a baseline level of education and skill specialization not taught to blacks at the time. Consequently, as the date on which abolition laws would come into effect approached, many Yankees, instead of freeing their slaves, sold them in southern slave markets. So much for enlightened empathy. What we can gather from this is that any pretense that the northern population wanted to end slavery for egalitarian reasons is false. Although many of them did wish to see slavery end in their home states so that they can have a racially pure population, they mostly did not favor freeing slaves in the South, fearing that freed blacks would travel north and not only contaminate their societies, but also create job insecurity for poor whites. As one Connecticut Union official put it, quote, unless the legislature adopted appropriate entry restrictions, the sons of Connecticut would soon be driven from the state by the great influx of black porters, black truckmen, black sawyers, black mechanics, and black laborers of every description, close quote. Just before the Civil War, blacks composed 40% of the U.S. Southern population and just 1% of the North's, and most Northern whites wanted to keep it that way. For all of the historical characterization of the pre-Civil War Northern population being anti-slavery, the abolitionist movement existed on the fringe of mainstream discourse, with the Northern anti-slavery organizations having only 1,475 members in the early 1830s. Lincoln himself denounced the abolitionists as zealots, and expressed that towards them he stood, quote, fully and as I trust, effectually and enduringly arrayed against, close quote. Also adding that the public attacks they received were, quote, just execration, close quote. The desire for black exclusion in the North was clearly expressed by Republican Congressman of Massachusetts George Boutwell, who admitted that he wanted to give ex-slaves the rights to vote for the primary purpose of putting them on Native American-style reservations in the South, which would keep them away from him, content with their placation of apartheid enfranchisement. In reality, the New England political class, notorious for its arrogance and sense of moral superiority over the rest of the country, looked down upon the racial intermingling in the South, even with blacks as subordinates. As author Samuel Mitchum Jr. states of Southern culture, quote, "The servants attended church with their masters, listened to the same sermons, lived on the same property, traveled in the same wagons and carriages, and sometimes lived in the same houses. Black women often served as wet nurses for white babies, something Northerners found offensive, if not odious." Close quote. This analysis aligns with another made by the French diplomat and social scientist Alexis de Tocqueville during his travels throughout the antebellum United States, which was the subject of his now classic 1835 book, Democracy in America. De Tocqueville observed race relations in the United States up close and wrote that, quote, "The prejudice of race appears to be stronger in the states that have abolished slavery than in those where it still exists, and nowhere is it so intolerant as in those states where servitude has never been known." Close quote. He also said that the Southern people were, quote, "much more tolerant and compassionate towards blacks than Northerners." He was not the only foreign visitor to take note of this. The North British Review in 1862 wrote that in the North, quote, "free Negroes are treated like lepers," close quote. Another British journalist wrote that, quote, "the North dislikes the Negro even more than the South does," close quote. Perhaps the most prevalent misrepresentation about the pre-Civil War United States is that the North was more tolerant of blacks living amongst them than the South was, when in reality, it was the South that was much more tolerant. Race relations between blacks and whites in the South would not truly become toxic until the Reconstruction era that followed the war, due to the racial tensions stoked by radical Republicans in order to achieve political dominance over the South, because that, in fact, was the North's motivation behind the war. The utter subversion of the Southern states for sheer power, divorced from any actual humanity towards blacks. That, and the New England Puritans wanted to be able to show off their virtuousness to the world without actually helping anybody, much like the virtue signaling woke activists of today, whose ideology is also, coincidentally, a product of coastal elitism. If Northerners actually cared about blacks, then following the war, they would not have allowed slavery in the South to continue existing in every way but name.
Thank you for watching that episode of Cancel Lincoln. If you enjoyed the video, do me a favor, hit the like button and subscribe to my channel while you're at it. It really goes a long way in spreading the content. Thank you again, fellow rabble-rousers.